First, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me. One, I love coming and having the opportunity to speak about my research. I'm located in the Netherlands. That's where Leiden is, in case anyone was Googling it. But I'm originally from New York, so it's nice to be in my hometown. I usually say at other lectures, I'm from New York, so sometimes I have a tendency to speak too quickly, but maybe this audience will be indulgent. It's really a pleasure to be here and to speak just a little bit about my research. And perfect, so it's up. Because there was some historical overview given before in the last session, but I wanted to give you some numbers about Jewish population in the Middle East and North Africa so we know what we're talking about, right? And this is a diverse region. Different languages, different traditions, different minhagim, dress, styles of prayer and history. And there are similarities and there are differences. And I think it's interesting to juxtapose Iraq and Egypt because there are some similarities and some differences. Oh, and in case anyone's curious, these are the Della Pergola numbers of population. Sergio Della Pergola, he is the Jewish demographer. He's at Hebrew University. And if you want to know anything about Jews and how many Jews and where, he's the guy. Again, Google, wonderful thing. But today's talk and this whole day is really about the end of Jewish life in the Muslim world. And this is a question, right? What brings about the dissolution of Jewish communities in the Arab world in the mid-20th century? Is it the creation of the State of Israel? Is it Arab nationalism, pan-Arabism, Islamization, decolonization, or something else? And I thought it was nice to start with a quote by Esther Meyer-Glitzenstein, because she was actually the one who gave Dr. Ohayon my name to come speak here. And I think she's an amazing scholar and such an inspiration in her work. And she says both ideologies, and she's referring to Zionist ideologies and anti-Zionist ideologies in terms of how we read history, are biased, generalized, and simplistic views that ignore the complexity of the various processes that operated in the Iraqi Jewish community, Iraqi society, and the Middle East in general. After all, the mass immigration from Iraq was just the culmination or conclusions of a series of developments that resulted from the modernization and westernization of the Middle East, the rise of the Arab nation movements, and the Zionist Arab conflict over Palestine. So in my talk, I want to invite everybody to think beyond the last days of these Jewish communities, and I want to invite them to think about what happened before this in the first half of the 20th century, and how these communities, but also these individuals, situated themselves at a crossroads, and that this is very much in a context of modernization, of imperialism, both French and British primarily, certainly of new ideas about Judaism, new ideas about Zionism, Jewish nationalism, so that maybe we can understand this process from a new perspective. I'm going to present you with a little bit of background history, some chronologies, depending on how quickly I speak as well. I have 2 documents from some archives I've been looking at, and then I can offer perhaps a little bit of analysis and conclusions, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. And then, the floor will be yours, of course. So, we need to think about these Jewish communities in the Arab world in the 20th century as connected, right? They don't exist in a vacuum. They are connected with other Jewish communities in the Arab world. They are connected with Jews in Europe. And this is not a process that started after World War I. This is a process that started in the 19th century, right? And this process starts for multiple reasons. There's migration. You have Halabis, Aleppan Jews who go to Egypt. You have Iraqis who go to the Indian subcontinent. You have Moroccans who go to Venezuela, right? It becomes delocalized. And in addition to this, the previous speaker spoke about the Damascus affair. And the Damascus affair, which now I don't have to go into, so saving some time, sets off this idea of Jewish internationalism. And Jewish intellectuals and philanthropists begin to consider, how can we help Jews in disparate places? How can we help our suffering brethren, right? That's what happens in Aleppo. And they begin to found philanthropic organizations. And the most famous are the Alliance Israélite Universelle. I think if there are people in the audience here who grew up in the Middle East or North Africa, maybe you went to a school from the Alliance. You have the Anglo-Jewish Association, which is the equivalent in the Anglo-Jewish sphere, and they work closely together. And certainly after World War I, you have the JDC, right, out of New York, which is very important. And all of these communities in the Arab world are in contact with these organizations in different ways. And that's actually what I study when I'm alone in my office in Leiden. But we also have transnational religious networks as well. We have rabbis who talk to each other. We have rabbis who discuss questions of how do we deal with modernity? How do we deal with women being seen in public when their hair isn't covered? And they discuss these through newspapers, through letters, right, through responsa. And we can also begin to speak about a global Jewish media space. Jews are inherently multilingual, and you have Haskalah press in Hebrew, which these Jews are reading, but you have the English press, the Jewish Chronicle, 1841, oldest continuously published Jewish newspaper. It describes the Jewish community of Baghdad in the late 19th century as a model of Jewish gentrification. Interesting, right? And we know that the publications of the Alliance as well were sent to Jewish libraries throughout the Middle East and North Africa. So if we think about the 1930s, both Egyptian and Iraqi Jews are participating in diverse and dynamic transnational Jewish networks. Some are more secular, some are more religious, but they're connected, and they have this new idea of kind of an emergent Jewish identity. So, a little bit on Iraqi Jewry. I'm sure there'll be some Iraqi Jews in the audience afterwards who will want to tell me, what I missed in my very short synopsis. But it's a historic community, right? They trace their origins to the Babylonian exile, at least in spirit. By the early 20th century, it's an urban community, primarily in Baghdad, but certainly with important smaller communities in Basra and Mosul. There is an important diaspora community in the Indian subcontinent and East Asia, and also a little bit in the UK. And so people call themselves Baghdadi, and some of them reside in Iraq, but some of them reside in India, and they see this as an identity, right? They see this as their customs. And what's interesting in this whole period is people don't necessarily leave forever, right? In the 20s, the 30s, and the 19th century, they'll go, they'll make money, they'll remit funds, some people will go back, some people will settle there. But there's a real back and forth. And if you look at the pictures up here, which come from the 30s, it was a very happy time. It was a very hopeful time. The Jewish community flourished in this period. And when we look at how it flourished and why, in large part it was because of these transnational Jewish connections. The Alliance founded their second school in the world and their first school in Iraq in 1864. So you can imagine that by the beginning of the 20th century, these were established schools. And in the 1920s, 25% of the city of Baghdad was Jewish. Think about that, right? Right? It's not negligible. Baghdad was a Jewish city, and it had a beautiful, flourishing community who were part of a middle class, right? There was socioeconomic mobility. They were citizens. They voted. And they were interested about being Iraqi citizens, but they were also interested about being Jews and about being Jews in a new modern world which offered new choices. Similarly, Egyptian Jewry also saw a golden age in the 1920s and 30s. Similarly as well to Iraq, they had a long history. And by the late 19th, early 20th century, they were also an urban population, mostly in Cairo and Alexandria, like Iraq, an Alliance Israélite Universelle school in 1868. But to show how successful the community was, by 1919, the AIU considers its mission complete and transfers the management of the schools back to the community. So at this point, it's not just that these communities are receiving aid from their brethren in Europe, they're also participating and they're remitting funds back. And they're helping to build schools. Actually, for example, the female teachers college in Paris for the Alliance was built, the building was built with money from an Iraqi Jew. And the Egyptian Jewish community remitted funds to the Jewish community in Kislev after the Kislev pogrom. So there's this idea of a modern Jewish identity, right? Some Jews become citizens in 1929 with the 1929 Egyptian nationality law, but most don't apply for citizenship because they feel comfortable in their position, okay? And another example of the high level of education of these communities, the 1947 literacy rate for Egyptian Jewry was 82.2%, in a country who in 1976 only had a literacy rate of 38.2%. So what are the similarities and the differences very broadly? They're both historic communities. We're not talking about immigrant communities here. The larger Muslim populations would never call these groups immigrant groups. They were seen as established parts of these societies. They were active on their communal level within their Jewish communities, but also on the national level, right? Heskel Sasson, for example, who was mentioned today, but other people served in the parliament, advised princes and prime ministers, and they engaged with their society. When we talk about Zionism, I think we can characterize it as ambivalent. And when I say ambivalent, I'm talking about the Oxford English Dictionary definition, not how it's used today. They were conflicted. They were very aware of the situation in Palestine, and they were aware of it because they went on vacation there. You hear Jewish women talking about how they loved to go on vacation to Palestine because it was a place where they could wear a bathing suit on the beach in the 1930s, and it was socially acceptable to do this, right? They knew that it would be problematic, possibly from a political perspective, but it was exciting too, right? It was an exciting moment to see these communities being built up in Mandate Palestine. And this is, of course, even before after 1933. They continue to have these close ties with Jewish networks, both communities. After 33, both communities work hard to get Jews out of Germany and later out of Austria. And their lack of success also shows a certain weakness politically within these states because they're not able to save more of their brethren. So it's this balance, right? It's this balance between some agency in the transnational Jewish world, some agency as well within the local states, but also a certain weakness as a religious minority or a religious community. And I also put in here that in both communities, some Jews are active in local communist parties. And it's relatively small numbers, but it just is an example of the diversity of thought, right? We can't talk about one block of thought, one block of ideology. Every individual has their own story. Every individual has their position. But there are some other interesting differences between these two groups. The Iraqi community was relatively homogeneous. You don't have a large Sephardic migration, for example. In Egypt, it was a heterogeneous communal composition. You had Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardi Jews, Halabis, Baghdadis, and in that way was much more decentralized. Also, in Iraq, the Jews were citizens. In Egypt, the majority still held foreign passports, right? In Iraq, the community was primarily Arabic-speaking, although multilingual. Most people would speak either English or French, depending on their education, and certainly had some rudimentary Hebrew. Whereas in Egypt, the community was much more linguistically diverse. Yeah, right. Speaking French primarily, but you also have children going to Anglican schools and speaking English, for example, and some people have English as their home language. Most people would have either French or Arabic, depending where they were, as their home language, but also Italian in some cases, right? Exactly. So it's a very cosmopolitan Jewish society. Iraq, the Jewish school system, had 27 Jewish schools in the city of Baghdad in the 1940s. It was the premier school system in Baghdad. to a point that until the Muslim population and the Christian populations built their own private schools, most elites went to the Jewish schools. In Egypt, most elite Jewish families would send their children to Christian missionary schools. But in both cases, it meant that Jews were actively engaged with the larger Muslim population, but also the Christian populations. What's next up here? So I wanted to kind of give two examples of networks and influence, which make it a little more specific. And this is one of my favorite pictures. It's of the girls at the Laura Kaduri School in Baghdad. The picture comes from the Alliance archives. I believe it's 1928. Laura Kaduri School was founded in 1893. It was the first girls' school in Iraq. It was founded, the money was given by Elie Kaduri, a wealthy Baghdadi Jew who was living in Shanghai. So another example of these transnational networks. His wife, who the school was named after, Laura Mokata, is actually a Sephardi Jew from London who was killed in a fire. The school was managed by the 1920s by the Jewish community of Baghdad, but it used a curriculum from the Alliance School in Paris. And the teachers came from Iraq, the Middle East and North Africa, and Europe. But most importantly, the school served all strata of Jewish society, and that's what this picture shows. So for those of you who read French, entrée scolaire, to help poor students, right, who didn't have enough lunch. And the idea was that the wealthy girls would bring in food, and they would cook the food together and eat together, which is a lovely idea. But it was really also something radical in 1920s Iraq, because these were women getting an education. And you can see that it wasn't just wealthy girls, part of the wealthy elite, it was also girls from more modest families. And just look at how they're dressed. I mean, you can see that's actually a teacher with bare shoulders. The girls have some of them have bobs in their hair. But they're eating at a table together. And so you can imagine that these girls have a very globalized Jewish identity by this period, right? It's not centered just in Baghdad. They have an idea that there are people in Paris, there are people in Shanghai, and they care about us. And conversely, we have a responsibility to care about them. The other document, also from the Alliance archives, which I translated, so if anyone's curious the original text, I can email it to you. It comes from 1918, and it's a discussion about helping Jews in Palestine. And it's from the president of the Alliance branch and the president of the community in Alexandria to the head office in Paris. And he says, at the moment, the community is preoccupied in collecting funds to help our co-religionists in Palestine. The community is outside of any political movement, and in Palestine only sees suffering people in need of assistance. For my part, I am Italian via my two sons, who are serving on the front line, Egyptian by my attachments here, French by my education, and English by my occupation. And I admit that I do not feel the need for a fifth homeland. Right? It's a powerful statement, but if we position it in 1918, it's the end of World War I. There is tremendous hope for the future. It's a community which has seen war, has seen changes in leaders, but has overall seen their position improve. And so he doesn't really want to rock the boat, but he's deeply invested in the Jewish community. He's the president of the Jewish community of Alexandria. He's not negative, he's not anti, he's just speaking from his heart in this private letter that he didn't imagine someone would be reading 100 years later in New York, right? And I think these two documents very much show the complexity of these communities, this idea of a certain political precarity, but very much being part of the place they live, but also the place where their ancestors have lived for generations, and also feeling attached to the Jewish world and caring about their brethren, not just in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in Europe, right? Let's see. So what happens, right? Very briefly, without going into details, little by little, in the 1940s, rights and securities are eroded. The Farhud, which was mentioned today, earlier speaker said 179, I used 180. I think we can agree that it's more or less the same, killed I mean, it was a shocking, terrifying event. And one could think that the Jewish population would have left after such an event, but they didn't. One reason they didn't is because it's 1941, and where were they going to go, right? And many people actually asked for visas to go to India, and they were denied. So, but then afterwards, the situation improved after 1945. And again, where were they going to go in 1945 and 1946? It's interesting, the community more or less dissolves between 1949 and 1952. They're still building new Jewish schools in 1947. Because when your community has existed for centuries, it's very difficult to imagine that it could dissolve in the course of a couple of years, right? In 1948, though, the Jewish civil servants are dismissed, quotas are placed on university students, and merchants are denied trade licenses. So if you lose your profession, right, how are you going to continue? If you're put under martial law and you can't leave the country, this is no longer just about not being able to go on holiday. This is also a question about your livelihood and your personal security. And in the period between 1949 and 1952, the majority of Jews settled in Israel because their time there was over, and life was impossible, right? But it wasn't taken lightly. It's a traumatic event, which people are still trying to process to this day. And so if you're interested in the topic, I invite you to read some of the amazing biographies of the Jews who came from these countries, because you'll see that it's not one narrative. It's many narratives, because everybody's life is different and everybody's connections are different. Egypt, remember I mentioned that 1929 law? Oh, sorry, I didn't mention it yet. But most Jews were involved in commerce and weren't citizens because they decided to maintain their European citizenships. But in 1947, a law is made that all companies and subsidiaries of foreign companies in Egypt must employ 75% Egyptian citizens and 40% of their boards. So again, you see the livelihood of these communities undermined. Jews are prevented from leaving the country in 1948, and many Jews who aren't citizens find themselves stateless. They're accused of being communists, okay? And little by little, for the same reasons, we see these Jewish communities beginning to leave. And by 1967, 1970, almost all remaining Jews leave Egypt. So, just some conclusions. In the 1920s and 30s, we see a symbiosis, right, between the national and the transnational. These networks benefit the larger Arab world. These schools, hospitals, and charities, they don't just benefit Jews. And so even within the larger populations, this is seen as a good thing. And in doing so, it gives prestige to local Jewish communities because they're seen as important members of these larger societies. And it gives prestige to the Jewish communities in Europe or in the Far East who are assisting them. These are multiple networks, as I said before, where people identify as being an Iraqi and a Jew, and that's not seen as problematic, right? But when we talk about the end of these communities, it's not that the state of Israel is declared and there's a war and they leave. It's that there are questions, and these people don't know what to do. They don't know if the state of Israel is going to be victorious in its army, right? It's a traumatic process. It's a painful process to leave your home and not know what the future holds. And I think that's something that anyone who's ever had to do that will process for a lifetime. But it's this slow erosion of security and societal position, of course, which I would say is what leads to the mass exodus, and this idea of citizenship as well, right? What does citizenship mean if your rights are not respected? It means nothing. But in the archival documents, you certainly see this economic concern. And I want to bring that up because obviously security is a concern, but there is a difference, and it shows that people are really trying to think, what should we do? Because no one has a crystal ball and no one can see the future. But I kind of wanted to end with this idea of that Jewish communities flourish in an environment where transnational connections are valued, right? where internationalism is valued. And this is what we see in the first half of the 20th century when these two communities flourish. But with the rise of Arab nationalism and this inability to be able to differentiate between different issues, it makes life impossible for these communities. Thank you very much.